Hundreds of thousands of researchers around the world are working to improve life and address imminent threats to humanity. Often their research ends up in the scientific valley of death in the form of publications and patents that never see the light of day. That is about to change. Welcome to the Lab to Startup podcast, hosted by Naresh Sunkara, founder and executive director of the Berkeley Postdoc Entrepreneurship Program at the University of California, Berkeley. This show has two main goals: share the stories of those who have successfully founded startups based on their own research, and highlight resources needed to help those aspiring to launch startups in the deep tech space. Whether it's electric cars, vaccines, addressing climate change concerns, or possibly establishing life on other planets, Naresh and his esteemed guests want to help scientists, engineers, faculty, and researchers bring their innovations to market. Learn more and subscribe today at labtostartup.com. And now, here's Naresh.
My guest today is Matt Price, the co-founder and president of Activate, a program teaching scientists how to bring their research to market. He was previously the managing director of Cyclotron Road and comes with experiences in the renewable energy space, material science, and venture capital industry. In this episode of Lab to Startup, we will talk about the Activate Fellowship Program, its origins, especially how they navigated carving out a niche but much needed space for supporting scientists to build startups. And then we will discuss details about the application process, challenges that the fellows generally face in the space, the support they provide, and what they actually look for in an idea or a founder trying to commercialize research. We will then find out more about the recently announced NSF Fellowships for Scientists and Engineers in collaboration with Activate Fellowships Program. The fascinating part of the program is how they take no equity while providing scientists with money, space, and resources to explore the possibility of building a startup. I highly recommend this program and hope the audience will benefit from this conversation. Matt, welcome to the show. I'm a big fan of the Activate program and have been looking forward to this for a long time. And I'm glad we finally are having this conversation. And thanks to our mutual friend, Jill Fuss at Activate Berkeley, who connected us.
Yeah, likewise. And Jill's an amazing addition to the team. So glad that she could do that.
I think a good place to start this conversation would be to talk about what Activate is. Maybe we can go back to Cyclotron Road days to frame the background.
Yeah, let me just start with the first part of that question of what is Activate? And then happy to go through elements of the origin story and our ties to Cyclotron Road. But simply, Activate's a nonprofit organization that empowers scientists to change the world. We do that by running what we call an entrepreneurial science fellowship program called the Activate Fellows Program. It's a 2-year fellowship, and it's focused on providing scientists with a sandbox for being able to translate their scientific discoveries into commercial solutions. In the sandbox, there's money. We give them about $100,000 per year over 2 years, plus another $100,000 for their project research funds. Probably more importantly, we also give them access to R&D space for them to be able to get learnings on their technology. And then probably even most importantly, there's a really powerful and inclusive community of mentors and advisors and those who've been there before who help share their trials and tribulations from prior commercial endeavors with our fellows. Again, it's a 2-year fellowship. So every year we run a process to bring in new fellows into our program. It's created this nice cadence where at any given time, we've got 2 different cohorts of fellows operating in this fellowship program, one in the first year of their journey and one in the second year. And then we've been doing this for long enough that we've got a really ripe community of alumni who are part of this community. Yeah, so that's Activate. You want me to go back to the origin stories in Cyclotron Road?
Yes, I think that'll set the stage for a lot of the conversation. Tell us about the origin about this program.
The origin, as I think all startup stories can go back really far, but we won't maybe go back all the way to the very beginning. I think a normal starting point is Alon Gur, who was the CEO at Activate and had kind of the original concept for a new model for supporting entrepreneurial scientific founders who want to work in a commercially oriented way. He had done his PhD in material science at UC Berkeley, had started a couple of science-based or was involved with the founding and the starting up of a solar company and a battery company, and then was at ARPA-E, where got a lot of experience in seeing what it looks like for government agencies working at the intersection of really transformational science-based innovations and giving that money to different types of stakeholders, whether it's venture capital backed startups or academic institutions or universities. And when he was wrapping up his 3 years at ARPA-E was at a time when venture capital had really drawn back from investing in and providing seed stage or Series A capital to these science-based innovations. And Alon's kind of purview into founding this idea was society is really struggling with not having access to a more sustainable way of how we think about consumption of energy and resources and having a healthy planet. Government can only do so much. The private markets need to be engaged with this. But after some of the lessons learned in kind of the early clean tech 1.0, as it gets referred to in the industry, was really concerned about how healthy of a pathway is there for those scientists who want to work on these really hard, challenging problems that can have a big impact on society. So Alon partnered up with another PhD at Berkeley named Sebastian Lonis, and the two of them started to whiteboard with some of the leadership at Berkeley Lab about how would they go about solving this problem of creating a more effective pathway for helping scientists who want to work in translating their scientific innovations into commercial impact. And what they drew up on the whiteboard is those scientists need time. And so that time gets translated into 2 years in our program. They need to be able to work on this full time and therefore need to have some income to cover their lifestyles while they're working on this full time. So that's where the kind of the fellowship stipend comes in. They need some initial startup money to get learning curves on the technology. So that's where the money comes in for the project research funds. But then they need a place. They need a safe place space to actually get learning cycles on their technology and develop the technology in a way that is commercially oriented in nature versus what we often see in kind of the basic science and academic field, where the technology development is more about proving novelty and less about proving commercial viability. But that's where the partnership with Berkeley Lab came into the original part of the model was, could we take these scientists who want to work in this way and give them access to existing lab space at a world-class research institution? And then they need to not make the same mistakes that a lot of founders have made before in the past. And so that's where this community comes in, where we've from day one spent a lot of time drawing on and benefiting from other science-based founders who have been successful in commercializing their technologies through a variety of different financing pathways. And so this whiteboard approach was originally financially supported by Dr. Paul Alvasados, who's the director of Berkeley Lab at the time. The stories that I heard, because I showed up about 3 months later, was, I don't know if this idea is going to work, Alon and Sebastian, but here's some initial money to figure out whether there's actually a demand for scientists who want to work in this way. If there are, can Berkeley Lab be a good partner for them? And if we can be, can the two of you figure out how to enable those scientific entrepreneurs to have a runway that goes beyond these 2 years in the program? So they did that. They stood up a website. 150 people applied in 2 weeks, and Alon and Sebastian drew on their network to find some really bright people to get into a room to help evaluate those initial applicants. We didn't call them fellows at the time because we didn't even know that this was a fellowship program at the point. The Department of Energy and somebody from the Advanced Manufacturing Office, Mark Johnson, was a part of that review process. And both Berkeley Lab and the Department of Energy and Alon and Sebastian and the other people in the room, like, there's, I think, 8 great fellows, 6 great projects in here. Let's find a way to support them in this model and to see if it works. And that was the origin. It had different names at the time. I think M37 was the initial first name that Alon and Sebastian kind of tracked back to the beginning of this model. And then it evolved into this name of Cyclotron Road, which was kind of homage to the address at Berkeley Lab, but also had some playfulness around an accelerator concept, which, again, we didn't know if this was an accelerator, an incubator, or a program, or a fellowship, but sounds like not a lot of people thought Cyclotron Road would be a good branded name, but they liked it and they stuck with it, and it ended up creating a really strong initial foundation, which is where I got pulled into this. Is once, maybe a couple of months after those first scientists were selected into this program, I think Alon and Sebastian were able to de-risk the first 2 big parts, which is, would anybody apply? And if they apply, are they going to get value out of doing their work at Berkeley Lab? And the answers to that seem to be like, yes, a lot of people applied, and the initial orientation into Berkeley Lab seemed to be going really successfully. So then the question became, like, how do we start building a team of experienced entrepreneurs and investors and kind of other advisors around this? Alon had reached out looking for an entrepreneur in residence to ultimately help figure out what is a business model for an organization that could take this type of concept and scale it beyond just Berkeley and the Berkeley Lab community. My journey to this problem is I was a material scientist. I spent about 10 years in solid oxide fuel cell development for a few different startups and was really interested at the intersection between new business innovation and the marketplace, and came out to California to get a graduate degree and spent a lot of time looking at startup companies that I thought would be really interesting to either join or go start. And didn't find any that met my threshold that I was excited about in the 2007 timeframe, and had an opportunity to go to a venture capital firm called Nth Power, which is one of the really early leaders in focusing on making venture capital investments in early stage energy companies, and spent about 5 years there meeting phenomenal technologists, entrepreneurs, and building some really interesting companies. And then 2012, my operator hat started to, or at least the voices in my head that wanted to get back more to an operating role started to speak more loudly. And I wanted to go put to practice some of the business strategy and insights that we had on the investment side to practice. So I went and did that for 4 or 5 years with an energy efficiency IoT company called Enlighted, which was venture capital backed, grew substantially in the years that we were there. And so when Alon had reached out with this entrepreneur in residence role, I really saw what he was doing as something that could be very interesting in shifting the cost curve in terms of how much time and how much equity dollars it takes to move these innovations forward. And I wanted to know how much this could shift the curve. And I thought the best way to do that is to figure out with him, what is the business model for an organization that could partner with Berkeley Lab and other institutions. So we looked at, do we create a fund? Do we create a consulting arm? Do we create like an incubator accelerator? Do we create a nonprofit organization? And ultimately, when we looked at what we thought was going to be the recipe for success, created a nonprofit organization that worked with government agencies, corporations, and foundations and philanthropists to take these ideas that are at such a really early stage and too risky to attract private capital, which is a big fundamental thesis for what we were willing and able to support, was the right construct. And so we created a nonprofit organization. It had one program called Cyclotron Road, which is a public-private partnership model between our organization and Berkeley Lab. And I think for the first year, we called it a model because we didn't know what else to call it. And by the second year, this idea of a fellowship really resonated with our different partners. So we called it a fellowship program.
Thank you for sharing that story. Basically, you thought there was need for money, space, time, and education needed for these scientists who are trying to commercialize. That was the origin of this story. And then I've known Ilan and Seb for years, and they've done a phenomenal job. And I also work with Paul Alvisatos, and I think he's always been that seeding catalyst kind of a person. And I'm glad this came together. You mentioned about money and space. In the startup world, there is this known ecosystem where incubators and accelerators exist, which provide these things. What sort of problems were you trying to address when you started the fellowship? You said you don't know if you guys were an incubator or an accelerator. Walk me through that thought process.
Yeah. I mean, this takes me back over 7 years now, but one of my lessons learned as a venture capitalist, and this resonated with Sebastian and Alon as well, was that one of the challenges that both entrepreneurs and or seed stage investors had in that early wave of clean tech investing is there was many examples of technologies that seemed like they had the potential and did prove to be very influential for creating commercial value, but they didn't necessarily fit into the business model of venture capital. I think as we looked at the business model of Activate and compared that to what is the business model of incubators and accelerators, oftentimes it's kind of common thread of like, follow the stream of money to figure out what the incentives are. And both with incubators and accelerators, most of them, certainly the ones that are operating with a for-profit structure, oftentimes that for-profit structure had similar color of money and similar kind of business model as venture capital. If we believed that really the only mechanism for financing the translation of science innovation from these really early stage to commercial impact was a venture model, I think then an element of like an incubator accelerator would have been a really viable consideration for us. But once we threw in like, hey, if somebody wants to do this as a open source IP and create a nonprofit and just give out access to this technology, like, shouldn't they be able to do that? And shouldn't we as an organization want to be able to facilitate that? What if an entrepreneur wants to like prove out the IP, but very quickly get it into the hands of a large customer, or a large strategic partner, and really scale the commercial impact, not in creating a new sales and marketing and customer service and manufacturing team, but leveraging a lot of the skill sets that are already there in industry. Because pretty much in all of the innovations that we're dealing with when we're talking about industrial technologies, there's already a really well-established supply chain and workforce that's there. Now, the venture capital model, even in the early days, but certainly now, is the idea of putting a few $1,000,000 into an innovation and then doing kind of an early acqui-hire into a large corporation doesn't fit the business model of how venture capital is set up right now, based upon the size of funds and the type of cash on cash returns that these funds require. And so our concern with, we didn't want to limit it. We had a hypothesis that there was multiple ways of scaling, or at least multiple ways of financing the translation of commercial impact. I think incubators and accelerators have proven to be a really effective for different types of innovations, especially in software and business model innovation and in some hardware innovation. But they all feed into this common color of money of venture. And we wanted to be able to keep a more open spectrum of how to finance those things. So in short, I think the accelerators, I think, have proven to be really good for founders who have an idea and want to clean up how to communicate that idea to investors and get some early insights from potential customers and strategic partners. Go to an accelerator and apply a very short and compressed time frame to get that story created and to see if investors are there. I think the incubator model is usually more driven by getting rent and just having desks and workbenches filled. Sometimes there's a threshold or a high bar set for the types of companies that different incubators will bring in. Some are less concerned. They just want to make sure that the desks and the workbenches are filled. And so for us, they're all really interesting elements, but they felt different than what we wanted to do in terms of being able to support different types of business models.
Great. I'd like to take a step back, and you mentioned something about the VC model. A lot of my audience is early stage scientists who don't really understand. You talk about VC model is where they give a few $1,000,000 and they go on. Maybe you can frame that model as well, and a quick summary. And who's ready for that money? Like, who are they putting the money into? What are the successes there? And why are these early stage folks not able to get that money?
If we go back to 2014, 2015 timeframe, when Alon, Sebastian, and I were getting this going, there was just so many examples of scientific entrepreneurs who had done kind of just called Gen 1, Gen 2, battery, biofuel, solar, manufacturing innovations in the 2005 to 2015 timeframe that wanted to go and do that again. But when they went down Sandhill or Route 28 and said, there's two of us coming out of this research institution, we've got a novel way of electrolyzing CO2 and turning it into high value chemicals. We need $5 million to take this initial data that we got from a research institution and build a prototype. I mean, this is a real story of one of the initial cyclotron road companies. And Sandhill and Route 20 were like, look, super interesting, but go build me a prototype and show that this even is remotely possible, and then come back. And those two founders were like, but we need a few $1,000,000 to do it. And they were just at a catch-22. And so before Alon and Sebastian stood up the website, one had a job offer at a consulting firm and one had a job offer at Google. And then they had this posting at Activate, or what was called Cyclotron Road. They had no idea what it was, but those two, Natasha and Kendra, who put in that application, they had conviction on what they were building and they wanted a chance. And at the time, there was nowhere else to go. There's a similar story for pretty much every one of the first Cyclotron Road participants at the stage. So that doesn't answer your question, Rash, about kind of Venture 101, but I think the experience that those early scientists had at Cyclotron Road in that 2014, 2015 timeframe is still somewhat of an environment that they're facing today. I mean, certainly it's a whole lot better today than it was in 2015, but the venture capital model, for those listeners that are not familiar with it, in some ways it's very nuanced, and it takes time to understand the language, and it takes time to understand both the economic decision making and the kind of emotional decision making behind it. But in other ways, it's pretty simple. It's, if as a scientific founder, you need money to hire people to help you develop the technology, and you need money to rent lab space and to buy equipment to develop that technology, venture capitalists will give you that money in exchange for some percentage of your business. They're going to do that because they believe that if you're successful in building your business, then you'll be able to sell your business either to a strategic acquirer or by going public. And you'll be able to sell your business for a whole lot higher value than the value of the shares that you sold to the investors initially. Now, with venture capital firms, the general strategy has been and the general philosophy has been is there's so much risk inherent in these early stage innovations, and venture capitalists are great at taking risks, but it's a calculated risk that they're taking. But these innovations are so risky that many of their investments will not generate any returns. And so a lot of the model is for them to put money into companies where they believe that for any one single investment that they make, that they'll have an opportunity to return the entire size of the fund that they're making that investment in. So if a fund is a $100 million fund, they're going to make an investment in a company with the belief that they're going to be able to return $100 million back into their fund at time of exit. And so if they need to return $100 million back in, and maybe they're owning 10% of the business at time of exit, you've got to get to $1 billion company, which is very doable with breakthrough innovations in big markets that are getting a lot of commercial success, but it takes a lot of time and money and risk to be able to get there. And so myself and different kind of founders who were a part of our community had a bunch of different examples where the technology was really valuable, but the opportunity to truly build $1 billion business behind just that technology wasn't going to be feasible. But the venture capitalists who make those investments at the earliest stage, they need to protect their investments. And if they're telling their investors, hey, we're going to go and put money into companies and we're going to do everything that we can to try to build $1 billion businesses, they're going to put controls and restraints and limitations about what entrepreneurs can and can't do as it relates to when they sell the business. It was that misalignment that we think is really important to try to address. And it's actually, I think, been one of the things that has been most valuable for the Activate Fellows is they're given that time and space to actually figure out what is the right source of capital for them and for their technologies.
Great. Thank you for summarizing that VC model. And I think Activate is filling that early stage need for funding to get them ready for a VC investment in many ways. And then VCs are generally driven by money, the profits, and you need to de-risk, and that's what Activate is helping on. And you mentioned one other point about how two of the first applicants were going to go for Google and a consulting job. And this brings back to our earlier conversation about brain drain. Matt, can you talk more about the brain drain problem?
I think it goes back to what is the fundamental problem that Activate is trying to solve for. It's overly simplistic, but I think we can classify it as a brain drain problem that we're trying to solve for, as shared by the example of the initial founders of 12 who wanted a chance to build that company. And the only source of capital at the time, venture capital, wasn't willing to support them at that early stage. So they were going to go to a large corporation or a consulting firm. And they weren't the only ones. Like, we just saw that time and time again. And Alon really saw this, I think, during his ARPA-E days of what are the incentives that happen at a large corporation who's working on advanced technologies, because he was giving money at ARPA-E to large corporations, to academia, and to startup companies. And largely the motivations of larger corporations is to think about getting evolutionary technologies that are 1 to 3 years away deployed, because a lot of the stresses that are on the executive leaders of those businesses are around short-term quarterly gains, and that's their incentive structure. And in academia, a lot of it is about publications. If researchers can get funded by different government agencies, including ARPA-E, to come up with new novel discoveries, then it seems to be very strong alignment with the government agencies. And if that can lead to publications, then that's really in strong alignment with the career pathway for those that are in academia. And then for those that are willing to and have ideas about how to innovate in things that are beyond the 1 to 3 years that the corporate R&D research environment is set for, really the only option is to continue to work with government agencies and SBIRs and STTRs, which is a primary funding mechanism from the Small Business Administration, which is an enormously helpful and influential tool. But you're looking at $100,000 to $200,000 for those first stages. And some of these technologies take $2, $3, $4, $5 million just to know whether there's a there. And so I think we spend about $70 billion a year training academic scientists in our country to learn how to manipulate the physical and biological like building blocks of our world. They've got these three pathways. They can go corporate R&D, they can go academia, or they can press their luck with venture. And in 2014, 2015, for those who want to work on these really risky science-based innovations, when venture wasn't willing to underwrite those risks, there wasn't anywhere else for them to go. But they're super smart people. I mean, they're very hireable at many different organizations, but they were going to end up working on either patents and publications in an academic setting, or they're going to be involved in moving business innovations forward on 1 to 3 year increments with a really low risk profile, or they're going to start software application companies and raise venture capital money just doing software, because at the time VCs were still willing to underwrite a fair amount of the innovation risk associated with dog walking apps and other software innovation. And so early on, Alon and Sebastian just heard from a bunch of people like, if you had another shot on goal, like, would you take it? And the answer is yes. Just somebody's got to figure out how to give me a shot on goal. And without that shot on goal, we were seeing a bunch of people leaving the innovation space of the scientific realm at a stage where our population is outpacing what our planet can handle, and our carbon footprint is outpacing what our atmosphere can handle. And we just have so many problems that deployment of existing solutions will make the world a better place, but it doesn't get us to where we need to be. So it's overly simplistic to call it a brain drain problem, because if we were in a sustainable business right now, or a sustainable society right now, then who cares what next great innovation a scientist is working on? But when our planet is hurting how it's hurting right now, like, we just can't afford to not have as many shots on goal as possible. One of the misnomers with Activate is an accelerator program or an incubator program to go launch new businesses. And that's not true. I think Activate is a fellowship program to teach scientists how to create commercial value with technology. If a scientist has never really thought about starting a company and doesn't know about business plans and hasn't thought about raising money and even thinks about the idea of doing those things is really not compelling, I would still say that they should take a look at Activate. If they want a career pathway to go into academia, Activate and the experience that they're going to get as an Activate fellow is probably a distraction from that career pathway. But any other job, we now have like data points, and I can make a pretty good case that they will get a better chance of getting hired by the companies that they want to get hired at a role higher than what they would be able to do if they didn't go through the learning experience that's associated with what the Activate Fellowship has really become about.
Absolutely. I 100% agree with that. I keep telling people, instead of going and getting that second or third postdoc, give a shot to a startup kind of an ecosystem where you will learn many, many more things than just your research. Maybe that's a good point to actually talk about the fellowships, the kinds of industries that you cover, the application process, and the selection criteria.
Yeah, so I'll go back to Activate's mission, where we empower scientists to make society better. So we keep a very broad lens in what that looks like. That becomes challenging as an executive in an organization to figure out how do you take that broad lens and then narrow it down into things that match with what society needs and what there's money to be able to support. And based upon kind of the experience and the skill set of the team that we've built at Activate. So we continue to stay interested and with a very strong commitment and belief that science can change the world for good in many broad industries and spectrums. Our team largely comes out of sectors that were tied to energy and climate and sustainability and derivative offshoots from that. So we do a fair bit in sensors and advanced computing. There's a huge energy load associated with computing technology. I mentioned I came out of an IoT company. There's an enormous need of dealing with communication consistency, how you distribute computing, how you have security on the computing. And so the types of industries we've supported, I think 106 companies over the last 7 years. It's across 8 different industries. And it ranges as broadly from agriculture to chemicals to electricity, transportation, computing, and defense. And there's maybe a couple of others that are on our website that I'm not entirely remembering. But it's broad. And then based upon those different industries where we think we're not operating in a sustainable way, we look for scientists who are innovating in this space. and we look for agencies and donors who are concerned about the problems that are being experienced in those different industries. And then ultimately a match gets made as a part of that selection process into the Activate Fellowship. And then we support them for the 2 years.
Great. Can you say more about the timelines? Like if you take an SBIR, it almost takes a year to get the money. What are your timelines like from the time an applicant puts in a proposal? And I think say more about the fellowship amounts. I know you mentioned it earlier, and the other benefits from the program.
So we've got applications open right now for cohort 2023. What that timeline looks like is applications opened on September 15th. They close on October 30th. We then have a review and selection process that wraps up by mid-March, and then usually are kicking off the beginning of that 2-year fellowship to mid-June. It's not as long as some of the government agencies, but there's a lot of great ideas that we get every year. And it's really risky and hard to do what society needs to get done. So we draw on a lot of external experts in our community to help us figure out what are the right people to bring into this program. For cohort 2023, we have about 40 spots across our 4 different communities. So we right now have a community structure whereby there's kind of a managing director and 2 deputies that spend their time as Activate staff overseeing the experience and the stewardship of each of the different fellowship communities. So we've got a community in Berkeley and in Boston and New York. And then we launched a virtual one called Activate Anywhere for fellows that aren't based in one of those 3 geographic and resident communities. And in terms of what they get, we base this off of a fellowship program that the Department of Energy's Advanced Manufacturing Office had initially drawn on. And we've continued to use that as what governs a lot of the structure for how we provide the funds for our fellows. So we can support up to 2 technical co-founders as fellows for each company. It ranges based upon age and experience, but just called $100,000 per fellow per year as a stipend that goes directly to them. And then $100,000 effectively to their company or to their research partner so that they can use that money to develop the technology. And then it's 2 years with our team to come up with a risk mitigation plan over those 2 years of how do you retire technical risk and how do you retire market, team, and finance risk over those 2 years. And for me, what success is at least by the end of that 2-year program, fellows can actually have data from industry deployments of their technology that say, I can show you quantifiably how valuable, how much economic value is created by this technology if this was deployed. So that's kind of data point number 1. Data point number 2 is they spend enough time understanding the market dynamics that they could say, if I did create a startup company to commercialize this, then here's how much of that value that's created by the technology my startup can extract or capture. And then the third data point is based upon those 2 things. What's the right source of capital? Am I trying to align myself to a venture capital firm that's a big billion-dollar fund and I want to go build a big billion-dollar organization? Or do I align myself with other sources of capital that are more focused on getting small amounts of equity dollars deployed and having this either licensed out to a bunch of different corporations or acqui-hired into other strategic companies? So we spend our time trying to help the fellows over the 2 years get quantifiable data points to those 3 questions. And if we can do so, then we can have success for them and have good alignment coming out of the program.
What do you look for in an idea or a founder at this early stage? And what kind of candidates have been coming through?
The eligibility information that we talk about on our website, I think, is 5 years of experience in an R&D type of setting. We've used that language versus saying you have to have a master's or a PhD or a postdoc. The reason for that eligibility is a fewfold. One is our organization is set up to help those who we believe can dramatically change the cost or the performance of how to accomplish really difficult things in industry. And so having a really strong understanding around the physical systems that they're operating in is really important, and having a really strong understanding of what technologies have people tried in the past and why haven't they worked and why this new innovation is such a substantial improvement from what was been tried before, I think is another element of success. The other element to this is a lot of our model is to have our fellows collaborating with existing research partners. started with Berkeley Lab, where we've got relationships with MIT and MIT Lincoln Lab in Boston. And we work with Columbia and other research institutions in New York. And a lot of the model is for the fellows to work very closely with and oftentimes in the lab of these existing institutions. And they're working with dangerous processes and dangerous chemicals and dangerous substances. And safety has to be of critical importance to anybody involved in working in these innovations. And so I think it's really important for us, and it's important for our research partners to have a strong, like a high level of confidence that the technical capabilities and the safety discipline that comes with experience in running a lab is a critical element for what we're looking for as a part of the minimum viable as a starting point for the fellows.
What are the lessons learned from the startups that worked really well, as opposed to things that you've taken chance on, if there's a theme or a few takeaways from your experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it goes to how does Activate define success? We've got a few different lenses for it, but if a fellow has a concept, or an applicant comes in as a fellow and has an idea and a concept that can potentially radically change how we think about electrolyzing CO2, they're going to come into our program because it's too risky for them to attract private capital, and they need to get some time and learning cycles about whether that technology actually can be commercially viable. And if in the 2 years they run a bunch of experiments and do the analysis, and it turns out that it can't be done and it's not a viable pathway, and they get to a clear no-go for them, we'll celebrate that as much as we'll celebrate somebody who turns out that their initial hypothesis around the value of their innovation plays out, and they raise a lot of money and start hiring a bunch of other scientists and staff to go grow that business. And this is why I think we really lean into, we're a fellows first organization, and we talk about ourselves as a fellowship, not as an incubator, as an accelerator. I think what's common in all of the applicants is they have this intellectual itch. They've been studying some element of the physical or biological world, and they've asked themselves, like, what if, or can this be done? And the ones who apply are the ones who will just work with a level of just like passion and commitment to scratch that intellectual itch. And if you scratch it and it turns out it's not viable, there's like an element of they're freed from that like intellectual handcuffs around like they want to know the unknown. And so for those that scratch that itch and it turns out it's not there, we'll continue to support them in figuring out like what is that next career pathway? Is it joining another company at Activate? Is it pivoting into something radically different than what they were doing before? Is it leaving the entrepreneurial ecosystem altogether and going and working for a consulting firm or a large corporation? We had a fellow who had an intellectual itch, and they itched it and then decided what they really cared about was starting a nonprofit organization that helped families that were dealing with drug addiction. And she went up on stage at our big event and celebrated this learning curve that she went through between starting her company that was working on science innovation to now running a nonprofit that's dealing with massive issues around the opioid epidemic across our country. So with that, I didn't answer your question, Naresh, but like with the element of success can be both success in commercial, or it could be success in killing the commercial idea. I think what determines kind of a successful fellow in our program is somebody that just has a huge curiosity of what are the risks that are associated with this idea being commercially viable. That curiosity can't just be internally thought about. It's got to be externally influenced as well. Like, what do the potential customers think? What do the investors think? What do potential hires that they would need to make into their company think? What do they as founders think? There's a exercise of going through and understanding what are those perceived risks, and then putting together a plan as best as you can systematically in an entrepreneurial setting, systematically retires those risks. And so there's a big time management for it too, because we're oftentimes supporting teams of one or two, and that's just not a lot of horsepower to deal with all the different perceived risks when you think about both technology and market and team and finance.
That is phenomenal, Matt. In my opinion, being a part of this program is probably the best way to scratch one's intellectual itch, with the possibility of benefiting the society as a side effect, and definitely learning a lot as a bigger side effect for those pursuing this route. Actually, notice this concept of intellectual itch as a common trait in many of my guests on this show. One of my guests, Irene Griswold-Prenner, who's the CEO of Nitrate Therapeutics, came across a mysterious nitration process while working on a project, and she continued to stay intrigued about this process and finally launched a startup almost after a decade to explore the subject. And she actually came up with a new class of enzymes with the potential to develop therapeutics. Can you imagine her and many like her having the resources to scratch that itch earlier? We might actually be solving a lot of problems in this world. I sincerely believe that building startups are the best way to move technologies out of the lab. And on that note, I want to go back to something you mentioned about market dynamics. I wanted to hear your thoughts about market research and technology readiness and what an aspiring founder applying to the program should think about. And what are you looking for at that early stage?
It's a great question. And I feel like it's one of the harder things to explain about Activate and our model that makes us different. But we'll keep coming back to we really select the fellows and not their technology or their concept. And it's for just the reason that you gave in your example, Narisha, of like, you don't know what the possibilities are. And we just need to create a safe spot for people who want to work in this way to have time to figure out where that value can be created. So a lot of the ideas that people apply to Activate with are never going to come to fruition. And they're going to have to do some really significant pivots, either in how they're trying to solve a pain point with inside of that market, or they're going to have to pivot outside of that market and industry altogether. And we've got others who pivot completely away from even the original technologies that they were starting with. And we want that. Like, we think that that's a really important element for how society is going to get the solutions that we ultimately need. Is we need this incredible innovative workforce to keep questioning the status quo and use this unique capability of manipulating science to do things differently, to just keep inventing things that get us on a better pathway. A lot of what we are looking for is around leadership capabilities and entrepreneurial potential, not in like, are they going to be a great CEO of this organization? But an entrepreneur for me is somebody who can operate in a resource constrained environment, which very much is the environment that any of the fellows are operating in. And then there's an element of, we look at the level of technical excellence that they've achieved in the past. It's not a great data point for whether they will be a successful fellow or successful in their commercialization endeavor, but oftentimes really understanding what were the limitations of technology before and being able to validate or show that this new technology is significantly better than those other approaches has been something that makes it easier to deal with some of the perceived risk that is faced in industry. And then there's an element of like, is there feasibility to being what's proposed? Because ultimately, if there's not feasibility behind it, and Activate has a reputation for supporting things that just don't have a lot of feasibility, I think we'll struggle to bring together the community that starts bringing a bridge to commercial success beyond the program.
Yeah, I'm glad these scientists are getting a chance for serendipity, I think, as they try, but they come to the table with some expertise, deep expertise. You're just not giving a chance to anybody and everybody. I'm glad you're doing this. And how do you work with the founders once they're selected? Maybe have some stories about how you help them with market adoption, regulatory investors, couple if you can share.
I don't remember when we started this, but it goes back many years now. We start with what we call T0 meetings. So it's for time equals zero. And it's right when they come into the program. We just ask the fellows, like, what does success look like for you? And it's super open-ended. And it's open-ended for a reason, because we'll look at success through the lens of, is this a career success? Is this a financial outcome success? Is this a influence in a business organization success? And we'll look at it through, what does it look like in a 2-year type of time frame? Like, how do you define success for yourself in 2 years? As we talked about in the beginning of this, we need solutions for 15 to 20 years from now. And many of these technologies will take that long as well. So we often are asking, like, what does success look like 10 years from now? What does it look like 40 years from now? And so these T0 meetings, like, most of it is asking that question through 3 different lenses, and then asking follow-up questions to really understand, like, what are those internal motivations, those excitement factors, those fear points that the fellows have internally. But then once we get a sense as to kind of their initial hypothesis of what success is we look at what are the resources that you have today in order for you to be successful, and then do a gap analysis of what resources are missing. And then from there, it's like, okay, now how do we go and start developing a plan to start acquiring those resources, since you're going to be in such a resource constrained environment? Practically speaking, where a lot of this gets distilled down into is, we're a really strong believer that technoeconomics and actually modeling out your cost structure and your economic value on paper is a much faster and much lower cost way of testing some of the first order principles behind your scientific innovation. So we've got an online curriculum that's open for anybody to go look at in terms of techno-economic videos that were put together by a former Cyclotron Road employee, now CEO of Amaro, Beth Zotter, and then another great consultant that we work with, Chris Burke from Burke Engineering, put together this phenomenal series on techno-economics. We make that available for everybody. We encourage our applicants to become very knowledgeable with those. But at best, early on, there's just not much data to inform some of those models. And over the next 2 years, we work with them on identifying, once you've done that first model, like what are your big error bars? And then how do you start going and getting either the data from experiments or the data from industry and investors about how to narrow those error bars? So that's a big element. And I would say most of the pivots that we have seen have happened because fellows come into the program with a hypothesis about where is the value of their technology. And we ask them if they've put it to paper in a techno-economic model. And sometimes they have. And oftentimes when they have, it's been with limited insight on some of the core assumptions. And then they continue to use that model to refine their development, their technology development pathway. And they use that to refine how they do customer discovery and get market insights. And then a lot of the times they run those techno-economic models and they realize like, shoot, what I'm doing just ends up being not that valuable or not that differentiated. Let me go start exploring some of the other market opportunities that could exist for this type of material platform. Design for manufacturing is another area where it's really hard to do design for manufacturing in an academic setting. But if we're talking about things lasting in the field and being for many, many years and being able to be manufactured using existing manufacturing techniques and approaches, thinking about that stuff at a very early stage and at the earliest stage is also really important. And then recently, I would say we've been spending a lot more of our time bringing in an element that recognizes just mentally like how hard it is to be a science-based entrepreneur and the leadership challenges that are associated with it and the time management that's associated with it. Like, as much as I think the Activate Fellowship is a phenomenal experience for anybody to go through who doesn't want to be a professor, it's hard. I won't lie. Like any Activate fellow will tell you it's hard, and any Activate staff will tell you it's hard. And that hardness is real. It's really real. And so a lot of our approach is how to develop an empathetic understanding of those risks and those emotional pain points that solo founders or small team founders have to go through.
I hope a lot more programs come up in a similar model. Speaking of which, have you tried applying this to any other use cases outside of the energy and the areas that you deal with, and any lessons learned in that space?
We haven't. We're 7 years old. I feel like we still talk about ourselves as being a startup. And I think the common message that we do give to the startup companies that we support is because it's so hard, being really focused on what you're good at is an important element to success. So I think Alon and I and Sebastian, we probably wanted to expand beyond Berkeley in the second year of the program. And we got some really good guidance from our advisors of like, don't do that. Make sure you operate really well with Berkeley Lab. They're a phenomenal partner. Make sure you're doing really well in California and getting some success points, and then think about it. So I think it took us like 4 years until we went to Boston. And then it took us another 2 years for us to do the New York and Anywhere program. So I think the only lens that we really looked at that question through is what was the startup guidance that software companies were being provided, whether it's like lean startup and a lot of the different either sage wisdom or books or blogs around like Startup 101 oftentimes applied to innovations where in a few months and on $50,000, you can create a prototype and actually get some feedback on it. That seemed to be what a majority of the frameworks and the models were based on in terms of innovations. And we just know that the design parameters upon innovating in the science-based innovation is just phenomenally different than if you're just operating with software. So then we looked at other things like Department of Defense, one of the main practitioners of, but certainly works with the Department of Energy, this idea of technology readiness levels, I think is an interesting framework that we looked at. Others have seen, limitations because that it's not just about technology. So you need to understand the market. So others came up with the market readiness levels, and that's also somewhat limiting because you need to have the two of them together oftentimes to think about what's your investment readiness. So I think others created like the investment readiness levels. And so we saw those individual frameworks. But for us, the thing that was missing is if you're moving along those different level spectrums out of balance, then your time management and your effectiveness in moving these things forward can actually really slow you down. You could go and spend 2 years just thinking about technology readiness levels and moving your technology readiness levels forward. But if you're doing that in the vacuum of understanding what the market's looking for, there's a good chance that you've wasted a bunch of time. Vice versa, if you go and spend a whole bunch of time just doing customer discovery and just talking to customers about what they want, you may get a really great signal about what industry wants, but your technology just can't do it. And then how do you think about financing the next stages of development? We've gotten really good at understanding who is providing financial support at different stages of maturity. But as we talked about in the beginning, it's really important to understand the business model of each of the sources of money and to make sure it doesn't encumber your ability to pivot into different directions. And so you go raise a whole bunch of money, but not know which market and which technology. You then use that money to go figure out the best way of moving this forward. But it only turns out that the best way of moving it forward is not well aligned with the people that gave you the money initially to learn that stuff. So what we created was something called the Activate Readiness Levels, which kind of marries a lot of these together. We actually look at how is the technology and the market and the team and the finance risk items getting reduced in relationship to each other over time. And I do think that that framework probably could be helpful for science-based innovations outside of energy and industrial sectors. We haven't practiced it much in the life science side. And a lot of that is like, that's not the expertise that we bring into it. And it seems like there's a lot of really great innovation that's happening by other players on the life science side.
I love that framing. I think a lot of these incubation systems, startup ecosystems take away one model or the other. Is it market ready? Market, customer, customer. And they just miss a lot of things and they try to apply it equally to all deep tech startups. And I'm not a big fan of these other models. I love this Activate Readiness Levels. Maybe that's a good segue to talk about outside of Berkeley and Activate ecosystems. I recently read about the NSF fellowships that you announced. Can you say more about that program?
Yeah. So, a lot of our model has been working with different sponsors to provide these fellowship dollars. So if you add up the money that I gave you over the 2-year time frame, you're looking at least $340,000 over those 2 years. And the sponsors get an enormous amount of leverage on it. I think we're delivering about 23x follow-on leverage dollars on top of like those initial sponsorship dollars. So it's nice having those data points and it makes it easier to find those sponsors. But that's a lot of what different elements of our team is looking at is who are the different government agencies, who are the different foundations and philanthropists who see the problems that society is facing and believes that our model around supporting scientists is a really powerful tool for doing that. It started with Berkeley Lab and the Department of Energy's Advanced Manufacturing Office in terms of supporting fellows at Berkeley Lab. The California Energy Commission then has been on the forefront of recognizing that, as we just talked about, Naresh, like the startup ecosystem for science-based innovations, even in California, isn't as strong as it could be. And the CEC, I think, has done a really excellent job of creating resources for Activate and other organizations to strengthen that in California. And then DARPA and the Microelectronics Technologies Office kind of asked us that question that you just asked, which is, well, can this model apply to things outside of just energy? Can you apply it to sensors and computing? And that's how we started working with the Microelectronics Technologies Office. And all of this was when we were supporting, call it 10 to 20 fellows a year. Our vision is to get up to at least 100 fellows a year in the US. And so we've been going down a journey of who would be kind of our gold standard customers that we think would believe in this model and just provide a lot of credibility, both to Activate and to the fellows that we're supporting. And NSF is just one of the fundamental leaders in both supporting scientific innovation at the science level, but also in being an engine around a bunch of innovation programs. Twice the amount of money as what other agencies provide in their phase 1 SBIRs. They were the engine behind the I-Corps program and teaching scientists to get out of the lab and go talk to industry and figure out what do they value and what do they perceive as risks and to feed that back into the system. We've been really excited about the potential of working with somebody like NSF to be a big sponsor for the fellowship. And yeah, it was a big source of pride, I think, for me and for the team to be able to announce that initial partnership with NSF a couple of weeks ago.
And the model is they go through the same application process as Activate, or is it a separate process?
Same application. One of the things that Alon and I and the team have held ourselves to, if we're going to do something, we've got to think about how it scales. Because if we're just doing this at the 8 fellows that we started with, that's not big enough for us. And we don't know that 100 fellows a year is the right number, but that's what we're shooting for. We've designed a lot of our processes and culture to try to bring scale into our operations as much as possible. So We have one application process each year for our cohorts, regardless of which community applicants want to apply to, and regardless of which sponsor is best aligned or associated with the innovation that those fellows are working on. And we get to the end of our selection process and we see what is the supply of talent that wants to come into this program. And then we play a really stressful game of matchmaking at the end with the different funding sources that are interested in supporting the talent pool that we've cultivated. And then we work with those agencies to then get them approved and then brought into the fellowship experience. And then away we go.
Great. I'm glad these departments like microelectronics and DARPA, NSF are coming to you to seek your experience. What have the VCs been doing? Like, are they coming to you to get some lessons in terms of what it takes to commercialize early stage technologies from universities? Were you able to educate them, and any subsequent developments, if any?
I don't think we've been doing much to educate the venture community. They're drawing on coming on like 60 years of experience of taking on and tackling the different risks. I think what the venture community has been wanting is opportunities for scientific entrepreneurs to be able to de-risk their innovations to the point where the investors can see a pathway for them to put money in and get money back out in the time frame that they want. I think one of the things that's been kind of most fun and rewarding for me is I was a principal at a venture capital firm in 2007 and 2012. A lot of my peers at that time are now have their own funds and are acting as financial stewards and leaders and investing in the next generation of great entrepreneurs. A lot of them are drawing on Activate as their pipeline for it. Unfortunately, the problem is so big, but fortunately, government agencies across the US and globally are now doing more to support it. We are seeing a huge influx of intellectual capital coming back in. We saw a similar level of excitement in 2006 after Inconvenient Truth came about. I don't know what the actual numbers are, but it feels much bigger. It feels much more real and long lasting than it did back in the 2006 timeframe. So fortunately, Activate's there, and there are other mechanisms that scientists can use to reduce the amount of time and equity dollars that are needed to commercialize these things. And fortunately, we've got a great number of entrepreneurial investors who've created funds to, I think, capitalize on a really ripe opportunity. That being said, like I'll call out, one of the limitations in the Activate model was the money was limited as a fellowship stipend to cover living costs or limited to technology development for things like filing a patent application or hiring like a business development consultant or buying equipment that's going to be used for manufacturing. Like you can't put that in a national lab and start manufacturing widgets and selling it. Like that's not what our national lab systems are meant for. But that's a really important element of getting to commercial success. And so we've been looking for and have been excited to find investors like Collaborative Fund with the Shared Futures Fund and Impact Science Ventures who have committed to write $100,000 checks into every one of Activate companies in our current cohort when they've met some preliminary milestones. And for me, it's like a really nice story because what we say is apply to Activate and get in because you're too risky for private capital. Do some of the things that we think are best practice, and that'll start reducing risks. Those are the milestones. And then when those milestones are hit, here are some great aligned investors who want to support your journey and believe that they will financially benefit from investing at this earliest stage. And so we just started to pilot that this year, but it seems to be working really well in terms of getting those fellows companies some flexible money that they can start doing some of those important commercial activities with, while also aligning with some really impressive company builders and investors.
That's such a fascinating story. And may I ask, what has been the toughest part in this journey so far? And if there are any lessons learned, if somebody else is trying to build such a program that they could avoid?
I mean, I remember talking to Alon at first and asked him the same questions like, how is this going to be any different from ARPA-E? And this is never going to work. And I think people at Berkeley Lab are like, this is never going to work. And other people in the Department of Energy are like, this is never going to work. I think there's been skepticism, and for good reason, from day one. And I think Alon and Sebastian just deserve an immense amount of credit from saying like, it may not work, but we're going to give it a try. We just keep coming back to that with our fellows. I think now, though, that the toughest part is we've got a phrase that we use at our big events, which is called delivering intimacy at scale. And what we mean by that is in the early days when it was just 8 fellows at Berkeley Lab with a team of just 3 or 4 of us. The fellows were all kind of in the same building on Thursdays, and the team was all there in that same building. And we were building our companies and they were building their companies. And it was just really strong community that was created by both the Activate team with the fellows and with the fellows between themselves. And through that, our messaging to the fellows then, and it's still similar today, which is like, look, 6.5 days out of the week are yours to do what you think is needed for you to be successful. But half of the day on Thursday is ours. So come up to Berkeley Lab, come to Building 50 where we were, spend time with each other, spend time with our Activate team, spend time with the visitors that we're going to just bring in. And there's going to be a whole bunch of spontaneous and serendipitous interactions that happen. And as long as we just keep surrounding really great people with other really great people, good things should happen. And that's been our mantra. That was really easy to do when it was just like one building, one small team, one cohort, 2 cohorts in Berkeley. Can we do that across 4 different communities, across the entire country, across 40 fellows? We only have 3 months of data to say whether we can or can't. So the data is limited, but the initial data suggests we've been successful in onboarding this most recent group of 40 fellows, and just did a big event with them where we asked that question, like, do we deliver intimacy at scale, like at this event and or at the events that were surrounding it? And we got a really resounding yes associated with it. But it's not easy. The staff that we have at Activate, the commitment that they make to figuring out how to deliver excellence in every single marginal hour that we have in our days just requires an immense amount of like work and thoughtfulness and energy. So we're doing it. If we're going to go up to 100, we've got to scale up by another 2.5x in order to do it. I think we can do it. If I didn't, I don't think we would be here. But I think delivering that level of intimacy at scale is going to be the hard thing. And I'm excited for the journey.
I'm sure you can do that. And I don't know how you scale that level of commitment in your team. I think that's going to be the tough part from my observation, but good luck with that. You've been very generous with your time, Matt. Are there things that we haven't covered about the program or any parting advice for applicants?
As I say to all of our fellows in any of their engagements, if there's not a call to action, they're missing an opportunity. So I've got 2 call to actions, if I can share those.
Yes, please.
Call to action number 1 is if you're a scientist who wants to use your skill sets to develop commercial value, apply to Activate now. And if you're not ready for it now, think about it again next year or think about it in 15 years. We'll be around and ready. But yeah, don't view this as I have to want to run and start a company. You just have to be really intellectually curious about whether you can create commercial value with the skill sets that you've invested the last 6 to 16 years of your life grooming and cultivating. So that's one call to action. The other is whether you're a potential applicant or a potential hire or a potential mentor or a potential donor, it really does take a community to execute at the level that we're at right now. And it's going to take a bigger community to execute at that 100 fellows a year. So you can find us in different social media forums at Activate Fellows. We've got a great newsletter put together by our marketing team that you can sign up for on the website, or we've got a great partnerships team that you can reach out to at partnerships@activate.org and just come with an ask about how you think you can help. And we've got a team ready to figure out the answer to that question.
Great. I will include the links on the show notes. But Matt, thank you so much. This was so much fun. I learned so much about the program, and I'm so glad that you're doing this. Wish you and the program lots of success as the world needs such technologies for humans to thrive on this planet. Thank you so much.
It was a total pleasure. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. And look, congratulations to all the different things that you've created between your postdoc program and the podcast. You're an innovator in your own right. And hopefully one of these days we get you as an Activate Fellow.
You're very kind. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Lab to Startup podcast. You can find links to the resources and programs mentioned in these episodes, connect with Naresh, or subscribe to this show at labtostartup.com.